Thank you everyone for coming. And I know we're going to have a few more people joining us, but yeah, Sam, we've got some folks from our team, from our spirits team, from our sales teams from across the country, and probably some just bourbon lovers that have stumbled into us. We appreciate all of you joining us for our Friday episode of Raising a Glass. This is something that Laura started with our team, over 2 months ago now. Who knew that we would still be doing this? But we've had great response, great education. I know that these Raising a Glass seminars have really taken me into my weekends, really inspired, and just feeling really good for the weekend, which I absolutely love. So we are really pleased to present Mr. Sam Medley today. Hi, Sam.
Hello. Can you all see and hear me?
We can see and hear you. We can see and hear you.
Well, then it's already off to a bad start.
So I'm here with Peter Vestinos, and we're really just going to give Sam the floor. And I did make some nice little slides here so that we'd have a couple other things to look at. Certainly, if anybody out there has questions, you can throw them in the chat or in the Q&A, and Laura and Peter and I will monitor that. Peter and I have worked with Sam for a number of years, so we can also help just drive some questions and some stories as well. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sam.
So Monique and Peter, we went over sort of the agenda yesterday, and I'm just going to follow what that is and what we were going to talk about. And then because I can't see the chat, I can see it if I change my screen. So I'll do that so I can see the chat.
We'll keep it. We'll keep an eye on it for you.
Then I can't see the screen. So I'm just going to follow the agenda as we talked about, and then you guys let me know if people have questions or you want to interrupt. But first, some of you know who I am and some of you don't, so I'll introduce myself. I'm Sam Medley. I'm, along with my father, the owner of Charles Medley Distillery, and we are a company based in Kentucky that owns a portfolio of brands of Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey that are distributed by Winebow and its subsidiaries in something like 12 or 14 markets, Monique, is that right?
But 12 or 14 markets for now, until I beat you up some other ones.
And then next year we'll see. But that portfolio are the brands Medley Brothers 102 proof, Wathen's Kentucky Bourbon single barrel, and Old Medley 12-year-old bourbon. And we'll talk about those brands later on, and people can ask questions if they have them about the brands. The company is just my father and myself, and my dad will be 79 at the end of this summer, and he is completely retired and out of the business. And I was just on the phone with him before I had this call, and he and my mother are at the park socially distancing and sitting in their car and watching the park goers and various things that you do when you're retired and your health isn't great. So he's having a good day today, so that's good. And you guys are not having a good day because you have to listen to me. But let's talk first about what is bourbon in general. And so I think a lot of you, particularly seeing the names on the list, are going to know a lot of this, so I won't take a ton of time on this. But bourbon is a type of whiskey, whiskey being a liquor that is distilled from mashed or ground grains. Bourbon in specific is made only in the United States, but not necessarily in Kentucky, and is traditionally made by mashing a majority of corn, at least 51% corn, with a combination of other grains, including rye, wheat, or malted barley, which are the ingredients in the picture that Monique has put up. Our Medley family mash bill or recipe that we have used, I'm the 4th generation to use the exact same mash bill, and we use the same mash bill for all of our brands, is a high corn, low rye, high malted barley mash bill. So our Medley family mash bill is 77% corn, 10% rye, 13% malted barley. We don't use any wheat. There are some bourbons that use wheat in place of rye, and there in fact are some 4-grain bourbons that use all 4. And there's bourbons that use other grains too, but these are the 4 traditional grains, and we use corn, rye, and malted barley. And each of those 3 grains brings something to the flavor profile of the final product of bourbon. And the corn generally brings what we think of as sweetness. The starch from the corn turns into fermentable sugars, and that gives bourbon a sweet note. My great-grandfather, Thomas Aquinas Medley, he died in 1940, and he was a distiller in the years prior to that. He was a Prohibition-era distiller, which is kind of a sucky job if you think about it. But he is said to have said, people drink bourbon because it's sweet, the sweetness comes from the corn. The more corn, the better. So he developed in the years after Prohibition what is now known as the Medley family mash bill, using 77% corn. And that brings a very straightforward sweetness to the final product. We haven't changed that mash bill in 75, 80 years, more or less. That's the mash bill he developed. That's the mash bill my grandfather used. That's the mash bill my father used for the products you're drinking today. And that's the mash bill that I will use when I direct production, which my directing of production is basically do everything exactly the same as my father did. I won't change one thing, not 1%. Everything will be the same. So the corn brings a sweetness. The rye, if you think of rye whiskey is sort of earthy or sort of peppery, sort of spicy. I kind of think of it as a dirty flavor, an earthy flavor to it. That's what rye brings to the final product of bourbon. And we use 10% rye, which is a lower rye percentage than a lot of distillers use. And again, today distillers often don't disclose their mash bills, or they have multiple mash bills, or they have one mash bill and want you to think that they have multiple mash bills, or what they disclose may not be exactly right. And that's totally okay. Ours is a low rye content. However, it should be noted that rye outpunches its weight in contribution to the flavor profile of bourbon. So a 10% rye, we think, contributes more than 10% of the flavor. So when you drink Medley bourbons, you'll note a little bit of spiciness or pepperiness or earthiness to it. That generally comes from the rye. The third component is the malted barley. And malted barley brings, in our opinion, and I always have to preface all my comments, and I know those of you that know me have heard me say this, that making bourbon is an art, not a science. If it were a science, well, the scientists would figure out exactly how to make it the best, and everybody would make it exactly the same. But it's an art. And so people's final products are slightly different. The flavor components are different. The textures are different. A lot of things are different. But we think that malted barley brings a sweetness to the finish. And so we think that our Medley bourbons are notable for having a sweetness on the back of the palate that a lot of people interpret using the word smooth. And so when people drink the Medley bourbons, whether it's Medley Brothers, Wathans, or Old Medley, or our special releases, one of the words we most commonly hear is, wow, that's smooth. We believe that that's because we're using about 2 or 3 times as much malted barley as most other distillers are using today. Now, part of that is because most other distillers use less because you don't need the malted barley anymore because of the commercial yeast additives, that the yeast technology has increased over the last several generations to where you don't need all that malted barley to convert that starches to sugar from the corn and alcohol, to convert the starches to alcohol. But you need a little bit, and then you can use your yeast additives. We haven't changed, not because we know anything more than anybody else. We haven't changed basically because we're obstinate, and I just do what my father did, who did what his father and uncle did, and they did what their father, Thomas Aquinas Medley, did. But big distillers like to reduce their malted barley content because it's by far the most expensive of the 3 ingredients. It's a finished product. You buy it from grain elevators who have finished, they've malted or sprouted the product, the barley, whereas the others you can buy directly from farmers. So when you're a big operation with big economies of scale, reducing that malted barley content can reduce your cost of ingredients by a lot. We're a small operation. We are a contract producer. We don't own a distillery. We contract someone else to produce for us. Neither we nor our contract producer are allowed by non-disclosure agreements to reveal that they produce for us or who produces our product. But we do the same thing, and we choose the farmers we want to buy from, and we choose the grains, etc. And so we choose to have our mash bill be a bit more expensive because of that higher malted barley content. But again, we think that that malted barley content puts a sweetness on the finish that people who are tasting our brands interpret as smooth. Another way that you'll hear an interpretation of that high malted barley content is we often hear, especially for our high proof and barrel proof brands, wow, I can't believe it's that high proof. So we'll have barrel proof brands that might be 127 proof, and people will taste it and say, I can't believe this is 127 proof. Again, it's art, not science, so I always say I think, but we think that's because of that high malted barley content, putting a sweetness on the finish, and thus making people interpret our brands as smooth.
Hey, too, Sam, we've worked together for a long time, but you know that I'm primarily always have been a Scotch drinker. And for a long time, I was very averse to really high corn bourbon, the ones that I knew were really high corn, because some of them can be incredibly sweet. I mean, really like corn syrupy level sweet, because I feel like there's a lack in balance. And I think that high malt content really comes through. I think it has a broader appeal. I didn't realize. So do you, you all know where you're sourcing, you were saying outside of the malted barley. So do you try to stick fairly close to home with the farmers that you're working with sourcing your grain?
What a great question. So the answer by the three ingredients, corn, rye, and malted barley, is yes, no, and no. So your ingredients to make Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey do not have to come from Kentucky. And in some cases, you can't really get, there's no grain elevator in Kentucky that can provide quantity of malted barley, et cetera. So we generally do try to stick to local corn farmers. Now, it's important to say that local does not necessarily mean Kentucky, because you can go across the river into Indiana where the terroir and the weather and everything is effectively the same. Thus, the product is effectively the same. So yes, we try to use local, and by local, I don't mean Kentucky, but I do mean the area, corn farmers, but the rye mostly comes from like Canada, Saskatchewan, and the malted barley largely comes from the upper Midwest, like Wisconsin and Minnesota these days, where we get it. I
think we've got some Wisconsins and Minnesotans on here. And it's fun to say
Wisconsin
Saskatchewan.
And Minnesotans. And Saskatchewanese people too, if you're here.
That seems like the answer to a trivia question.
What's the trivia question?
I don't know, but Saskatchewan's a good answer.
Where is the Guess Who from?
Are they from Saskatchewan?
Yeah, Burton Cummings is from Regina, Saskatchewan.
Who knew? Regina's fun to say too.
Actually, Tom Hanks and Peter Scolari were from Saskatchewan in Bosom Buddies.
Well, I think that's a fictional show, though.
It is, but it could still be a trivia question.
Still good trivia.
I mean, Isaac Q. Newton, who they set Rosen Island up with a date for, he was played by the great actor Paul Dooley. He was allegedly a citrus farmer from Saskatchewan.
That doesn't seem like a place where they would grow citrus.
Well, that's the point. Why would someone believe that? That's the joke.
We went down this road sooner than I thought we would.
Yes. You're always going to get a Golden Girls reference out of me. Okay, let's answer these next few topics, unless anyone has any questions. Monique, Peter, does anyone have any questions on the sort of ingredients that make bourbon?
Not at the moment.
So the difference between bourbon and Scotch is that bourbon, Scotch, Tennessee whiskey, other types of whiskeys all fall under the subheading of whiskey, which is any distilled spirit made from grain, effectively. But bourbon and Scotch and others have more specific rules about how they can be made. Bourbon, for example, has to be made in the United States, which doesn't necessarily affect the flavor, but it's one of the rules. But it also has to be at least 51% corn. It cannot be distilled at higher than 160 proof. And the reason is that you want some of the residual flavors of the ingredients to come through to the final product. If you distill vodka at 196 or 198 proof, at that point, the goal is to make none of the flavors of the original ingredients come through. But with bourbon, a maximum of 160, so you get the flavors of the grains to come through. Bourbon can be entered into the barrel the day it's made at no higher than 125 proof. A lot of big distillers like to enter at exactly 125 proof because you have to buy more barrels per production run if you enter at a lower proof. Traditionally, and this is a multi-generation thing, the Medley family has entered into the barrel at 117 proof. That's sort of a balance between that high proof and then that might save you money by not having to buy more barrels, and a lower proof that might produce a softer bourbon, but the cost becomes prohibitive. Unusually, several years ago, we're at about 10 or 11 years ago, my dad started doing a few barrels a year at 105 barrel entry proof. And the reason he did this, I said, Dad, because they suddenly are 8 years old, and I'm like, I'm running the company, and what do I do with these? Do I just bottle them as Waffens 94 proof? Then there was no point. Do I put them into Medley Brothers, which is a mix of a bunch of barrels at once when we bottle. It's not a single barrel. And I asked Dad, why did you do this? And he said, I just wanted to see how it turned out 8 years down the road, because my family, the Medley family, was putting bourbon into the barrel at the turn of the century at about 100 proof. And turn of the century is the turn of the 20th century, 120 years ago, not 20 years ago. And so I had these few barrels that went in at 105 proof, and I was like, what do I do with them? And that is how the initial special release of Wathen's Barrel Proof was born, is I had 25 barrels that were 8 years old that had gone into the barrel at 105, and so I wanted to sell those first 25 barrels at barrel proof, which would reflect a softer barrel proof because they had gone into the barrel at a lower proof 105 8 years prior to them being bottled.
Do you think, Sam, other than that kind of softness that you're speaking of, do you feel like there was a different effect? Like, do you feel like there was a marked difference in the flavor or the finish or the mouthfeel?
So what a great question. I don't think there was a difference in the flavor. And I think that that's largely because it's the same mash bill. It's the same everything. It's Medley bourbon. I do think there was a difference in, not the flavor components, but like the finish, those non-flavor mouth components. And I do think that all gravitated towards, wow, this is smooth. The heat was reduced at that point, even though they were 120 whatever proof. The most common thing we heard, and of course, when you introduce something new, you don't know what people are going to say. You don't know what is going to be the reception. The most common thing we heard when we introduced the Wathen's Barrel Proof to people who were picking single barrels of barrel proof bourbon from samples was, wow, I can't believe this is 120 whatever proof that the samples were. And all the samples were slightly different, of course. That was the most common thing. No, excuse me, I'm giving you the wrong numbers. The first year they were about 117 or so because they were all in at 105. So they were like 115, 117. The second year when we did Wathen's Barrel Proof, we did 25 barrels that were a lower barrel entry proof and 25 that were a higher barrel entry proof. But the point remains that the most common thing we heard was, wow, I can't believe this is this proof. It's so smooth at this proof.
And Sam, too, this kind of segues into the slide that we're looking at right now, but can you explain to people why, even though something would go into the barrel in Kentucky at 105 proof, it might come out higher?
Well, yeah, so I don't know about Scotland, and I've never been there, but we always say that there are, people ask us, and this is the next thing on here, why is bourbon associated with Kentucky? We always say, the Medley family has always said, there are 5 main reasons that bourbon works in Kentucky and has become associated with Kentucky. The first is the availability of the grains. Back when people started making bourbon, you could relatively easily get all of those grains from Kentucky or close by. Now today it's a little different because the quantity of some of the rye and malted barley is more than what is produced in Kentucky. But you can get all the grains relatively close. The second is the water from Kentucky that's used to make everyone's bourbon in Kentucky. Geologists tell me it comes from an aquifer under the state of Kentucky that's basically a river that runs to the north that runs through limestone. And so that limestone effectively serves as a filter for that water. So it's like the water has been filtered and everything, all of the other flavor components have been taken out. So the water is a very neutral water. And so it accepts the flavor components that are produced when you make bourbon. The third is the availability of the wood to make the barrels. So bourbon is aged by law in new charred white oak barrels. And what that means is that the barrels can only be used one time. They cannot be reused. And so the wood was especially a generation ago or 2 generations ago, but especially available in Kentucky. Most of that wood today comes from the Ozarks area, Missouri, etc. But 2 generations ago, my family had a cooperage. And if you look at the Medley Brothers bottle, it has the 5 brothers on it, one of whom is my grandfather. The one in the middle is my great uncle, Eddie. He ran the cooperage, and they had they took trees and made barrels themselves. So the first reason for Kentucky is the grains. The second is the water. The third is the availability of the wood for the barrels. The fourth is the unique weather. And this is the greatest distinction between Kentucky and Scotland. Kentucky has very hot, humid summers and very cold, humid winters. And so what that does is that hot humidity and that cold humidity in the summer, in the winter, push the bourbon into the barrel in the summer, soaks in like a sponge, and push it back out during the cold weather. Today we measure how old a bourbon is by the number of years it was aged, 6 years, 8 years, 4 years, whatever. Used to be that they measured by the number of summers that it was aged. And so you might have a bourbon that was made in April of 2007 and bottled in October of 2011, and they would say this bourbon is 5 summers old, whereas today that would be considered 4 years old. The reason the summers are important is those hot, miserable, humid summers push that bourbon into the barrel like a sponge. Scotland, it's not that humid and it's never that hot. So Scotch takes much longer. Some people say 3 to 4 years for Scotch for every 1 year of bourbon aging to achieve the same effects. The effects being the flavors that are imparted from the wood. Is that a good answer, Monique?
Yeah, it's a good answer. I just think it's interesting that you only really see in those kind of hot, humid climates a case in which a barrel, in case in which the liquid would come out of the barrel at higher proof than it went in.
So an interesting thing about that, yeah, for us bourbon producers, it is very normal to have barrels, and not every barrel increases. Almost all of them do. It's generally an aberration if one doesn't. But from the date of production to the date of bottling, they increase in proof because of that hot, humid weather that Monique just referenced. So if we go into the barrel at 117, it generally after 8 years is 125, 126, maybe even 128. If you were to age in a far less humid or less hot climate, you might come out of the barrel when you dump it 8 years later at about the same, maybe a little bit lower. Sometimes they even decrease a little, but it does have to do with that hot, humid climate.
Yeah, in a dry, cold climate like in Scotland, you tend to lose a couple % a year.
Very little though. You never lose as much as we gain. They never lose. Their maximum loss on proof is not as great as how much we in Kentucky gain on proof. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
The other fifth reason that bourbon is made in Kentucky is that bourbon distillers used to be all Catholic, and they got kind of persecuted and pushed out of the Maryland area and over the Appalachian Mountains. And so there's a big Catholic population in Kentucky, and in particular in the bourbon industry. That's a very Catholic production history. The people that were distillers were often Catholic. And so they hung together and they, married each other. And my great-grandfather, Thomas Aquinas Medley, was a 5th generation distiller, and he married my great-grandmother in 1902. Her name was Florence Ellen Wathen. She was the daughter of a 4th generation distiller. So there were 2 distilling families that had each effectively been in the business for 5 generations, the Medley family and the Wathen family, that married each other. Thomas Aquinas Medley married Florence Ellen Wathen in 1902. And that's sort of a common thing in the bourbon business. A lot of names repeat, a lot of family names repeat, and a lot of the names repeat at different distilleries that don't have the same name. You may be a Medley. For example, my second cousin, John Mark Medley, if you see the graphic, my grandfather is Wathen, 4th from the left. Ben has a grandson who is 1 year older than I am, who's one of my closest friends, and he is the head chemist of Buffalo Trace. And so that's just an example of Medley family. The name is not always working just on Medley products, and that happens a lot in the bourbon business. Should I look at these questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it is stuff that you will go over. I do think, Jeff brought up a good question.
Let's talk about that, the non-disclosure agreement. When we first started contract producing, which was in 2000, so 20 years ago, to get a contract production contract, we were asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement. And at the time, I didn't care. I wanted to get the bourbon made, so we signed it. A few years later, I was like, why is this a thing? I don't care if anyone knows where my bourbon is made. But I realized over time that the contract producers do care. A lot of the reason that they care is they own their own brands, and they don't want consumers to say, well, wait a second, if, you know, Monique's bourbon is made at Distillery X, and Monique's bourbon, to my palate, is so much better than the bourbon made under brand X by Distillery X, what is the problem with Distillery X? So distillers like to protect their own brands in that way. Similarly, what I don't want is a less informed consumer to say, well, Old Medley is $80 a bottle, but this bourbon that's made in the same distillery is only $40 a bottle. So I'm just going to buy it, and worst case scenario, pour it into an Old Medley bottle. The products made at the same facility are not always the same. Our production techniques, our mash bill, our barrel entry proof, our distillation proof, our barrel specs, our grain specs, everything can be different than those that other people made at that facility under a contract basis use, or that the distiller itself may use for its own brands. And so at first, I didn't care. Then I didn't like it. And now, having been in this for 20 years as a purchaser, contract purchaser, I understand why those agreements exist.
I think too, it's important, Sam, you're not just somebody that started doing this yesterday. You know, your family didn't, your family has a history in distillation and actually got to weigh in and oversee the process. I mean, so you know that these steps are being taken, you know that, you know, everything is as you would distill and bottle if you were doing it all yourself. And that's quite different than Monique, who decides to start a brand tomorrow, goes to Indiana, tastes a bunch of things and says, bottle it up, and had nothing to do with it. So what you're doing and have been doing
that's a business model, and that's totally okay. That's not what we do, but it is something that a lot of people do, and it's totally okay. I will say a couple of things. The first thing is, if you Google and read things online, you will learn that the Medley bourbons are made in every single distillery in Kentucky. Every single online sleuth has used various means to determine that Medley bourbon is made in this distillery or that distillery or another. And you can find information that people say where Medley bourbon is made in every single distillery in Kentucky that does contract production. In fact, we have used one single contract producer. This is our 21st year of using that exact same contract producer. That provides a continuity of product that is important to us. 8-10 years ago, contract production was very tight. And so we had contracts at that point that rolled over every year for 10 years that had a maximum amount that we could increase our production. Today, that bourbon is ready for sale. And I could sell all of it that I have plus a lot more, but I made as much as the contract would allow 8 or 10 years ago. Today, things are very different. There's a lot more production capacity that has come online in the state of Kentucky, both in the form of new distilleries, some of which are designed with their business enterprise entirely being we contract produce bourbon for other brands, and existing distilleries that have their own brands and have also done contract production have increased their capacity by increasing the number or size of their stills, which increases their production capacity without even building a new distillery. So today in 2020, I get calls from distillers in the state of Kentucky that say, we'd love to have you move your production to our facility. 10 years ago, I was like, can you please increase our production amount by this amount, please? Because we're gonna need that bourbon in 8 years. And the production capacity was so tight that the answer was always no, only as much as the contract allows. Today, Monique, you could go and produce as much bourbon as you want from various producers in the state of Kentucky, some of which are designed just to do contract production. So that's a difference in 10 years ago in production, but the effect that it has on product availability by quantity hits today, hits in this market.
And we'll talk a little bit more about that later too. Do you want to tackle the rest of this slide? I mean, just kind of talking about the real one of the things that I found really interesting when you and I first met was, and actually I had a really long conversation with your dad at Big Star here in Chicago one night, where essentially everything that some distillery that's doing that is new has been done before. And your dad, you know, has 78 years worth of stories about all the stuff that he used to do as a kid and all the things that he saw and he learned. But yeah, you want to talk a little bit more about family history?
Yeah, let me tell you a story that my dad, I'm you know, it's funny, I'm always self-conscious about repeating the stories that my dad tells because I didn't live them. And someone said to me once, you don't know that he's not just repeating stories that his dad and his uncle told. And so I was like, yeah, okay. So I sort of, you know, adopt his stories as my own, but give him credit. Each of the 5 guys in the picture that's there, the Medley brothers, are my grandfather and 4 of his brothers. And they each had a different role in Medley Distilling Company, which they started in 1937. They started Medley Distilling Company in 1937 with money that they borrowed from their mother, Florence Ellen Wathen, Medley. And they bought the distillery, which had originally been known as Green River Distillery. And they changed the name to Medley Distillery. It's in Owensboro, Kentucky. And they bought 1,100 barrels of bourbon that someone else had made, the people that owned it prior to them. And then they introduced Medley Brothers as a brand in 1940. And it's sort of a sad thing because they introduced it in September of 1940 and their father died in July of 1940. So he actually never tasted the brand Medley Brothers that had his son's pictures on it. So Wathen is my grandfather, and he was the president of Medley Distilling Company. He was not a distiller. He was not a scientist. He was a business person, and he was all about building the business. And in the 50s, Medley Distilling Company was actually a big contract producer that had some of their own brands that they sold around the country. So that's been flipped completely around over 2 generations. We're now a big contract production purchaser. But he was the CEO of the company, and Tommy, to his right, who's on the right of the 5 guys, was the actual master distiller in that generation. Tommy never had any children, but he was very close with my father. And so he taught my father everything, and my father was very close with him. And so Tommy was the distiller in that operation. They actually at one point had an interest in a distribution company. Ben, on the far left, ran and owned a distribution company. John ran the bottling operation. And Eddie, he died in 1953, so his timeline is shorter. But Eddie in the middle actually ran the cooperage operation. They made their own barrels. So each of the 5 brothers had a different role in Medley Distilling Company, and only one of them was actually a distiller. They sold Medley Distilling Company and its brands in 1958. And so after 1958, my family did not own an operating distillery, with the exception of Ben put together a startup distillery that ran for 9 months in 1966. And it was called Old Stanley Distillery. And it shut down after 9 months. And the property remained in my family's hands until within the last 5 years or so, a cousin of my father's sold that property off. But it had not been used as a distillery since 1966. So Tommy left and worked for another distiller for a while. But my grandfather was the president of Medley Distilling Company, even under other ownership, up until he retired in 1971. At that point, my dad took over, and he was the master distiller and president of Medley Distilling Company, or vice president of production, I guess at that point he was. And then he worked for them. They changed ownerships multiple times in the 70s and 80s. Ultimately, in the 90s, that distillery was owned by UDV, United Distillers and Vintners, which is now part of a little company you might have heard of called Diageo. And so my father is actually technically a retiree from Diageo. And so he receives retirement from Diageo, which a lot of people don't know, but that was his professional experience as a distiller working for another company until in the late 90s, he purchased back the property and the bourbon that he had made under the employment of what then became Diageo in 1998, under the employment of UDV, United Distillers and Vintners. And he started Wathens and Wathens only as a retirement project. And he started Wathans because that was a brand that my grandfather Wathan Medley had owned that had never been sold. And so he started Wathans back as a single barrel bourbon. My grandfather Wathan Medley, pictured there fourth from the left, pioneered the concept that today is known as single bourbon. And he never heard anyone use the term single bourbon because Blanton's was the first to use that term in the mid 80s, I think 1984, and he had died in 1980. So he never heard the term single barrel. But he, as the president of the company, often entertained production customers, distribution customers, et cetera, from around the country in his home. And so he always wanted to have his own brand of bourbon. So he would go in the warehouse, choose one barrel at a time, which is what today is known as single barrel, choose it from what he thought were the sweet spots in the warehouses, and he would take it, have the bottling house bottle it, and he'd put it in his own label, Wathan's Kentucky Bourbon. So the picture you have there is the label of Wathan's Kentucky Bourbon that we used from 1996, when my dad started this as a retirement project, until last year. And then we modernized the label last year. I don't know if you have a picture of that the white label of Wathan's, Monique. I don't know if you have that.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know that I put it in here.
But it looks like how the label looked when my grandfather did it, when he did it as Wathan's. So that's a little bit of the history of Wathan's. The history of Medley Brothers is that those guys on there were sixth-generation distillers, and they started that brand in 1940, sold it in 1958, changed hands a bunch of times, ultimately was discontinued in the late 80s. My dad and I recovered legally the rights to the brand and then reintroduced Medley Brothers in 2013 with an aim for putting it in premium cocktails and premium cocktail places around the country. And so it's a 4-year-old bourbon, 102 proof, with a flavor profile that's very receptive to cocktails and a brand that's very vintage looking.
Why 102 proof, Sam?
Well, that's a great question. So 100 proof is bottled in bond. And while we would qualify under the technical rules of being bottled in bond if we bottled it at 100 proof, bottled in bond requires you by law to reveal the distillery of production. And I can't do that because I have signed non-disclosure agreements, and I sure as hell don't want to violate those and risk my production contracts. So I thought, well, we'll just be one higher, and there's a pretty famous brand that's 101 that you guys have heard of. And in fact, since we launched this brand and today, they have redone their label where the biggest thing on their label by far is 101, which is what they're trying to sell. So I thought, let's just be 1 proof higher. So that's why 102. Wanted to be over 100 proof to appeal to craft cocktail bartenders because that's what they want for their product. Those of you who are bartenders, we heard a lot from bartenders when you start with a lower proof bourbon, particularly for craft cocktails, by the time you add multiple other low proof or non-alcoholic ingredients, if you don't start with a high proof bourbon, you're serving a weak drink. And bartenders don't want to serve a weak drink, and customers don't want to drink a weak drink. So this was designed as a high proof bourbon aimed for the craft cocktail market.
Peter, how do you feel about making cocktails with this bourbon?
I agree 100% for everything, pardon me, that Sam said and what he said earlier, particularly with the malt in this one. Usually my rule of thumb has always been sort of sip on my bourbons and mix with my ryes, but I 100% agree that Medley Brothers works in cocktails. It has enough grip, it has enough texture, and the proof is perfect. So
it was interesting when the three of us were talking yesterday, Sam. I was really touched, and I think all the three of us and probably everybody on here, we're real sensitive to the plight of all the bartenders right now. And so it's, you know, it's so interesting having made a product specifically to put in those folks' hands, and it's just like the future of lots of people is up in the air right now.
Well, and as I told you guys yesterday, this is a product that we currently are listing as out of stock. And the reason is because the bourbon that we made 4 years ago, so 2015, the bourbon that turned 4 in 2019, we don't have enough of it to satisfy all of the demand that we would have had prior to the COVID situation. But in addition, it turned 4, and it just wasn't ready yet. And we went round and round about, do we mix older bourbon in with it and use some of our bourbon that's designated to be Wathan's and in order to increase the flavor profile? And the flavor is good. The flavor is just green. And we decided this is a premium bourbon that is designed for use in cocktails, and we need to make sure that the product that is in this bourbon remains of that premium quality and reflects the Medley flavor profile. So we're not sourcing any bourbon, which we could do. We're not doing any of those tricks that you can do to extend, you know, make it a lower proof or anything like that. We're going to stick to Medley Brothers 102 and just tell our distributor and retail, most importantly, our bar and restaurant partners, this product is out of stock until the bourbon that we made is ready. I predict that we'll have some ready at the fourth quarter of this year. And I was telling Monique and Peter yesterday, we're going to do some type of relaunch. I don't know what it is, how it's going to work as an announcement in our key markets or with our key bartender and restaurant partners. And we don't know what things are going to be like when that happens, but we're going to find a way to do that in a way that works for whatever the new normal is for the on-premise craft cocktail market when our bourbon that we have already made is ready flavor profile wise in addition to age wise. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, so, I think a layer to this too, you know, Monique, you asked me what I think about making cocktails with this, but another layer for me, every time I build a back bar or cocktail program, is I really try and work with producers I know their product, I know they have some integrity. And there's kind of a running joke in Winebow that most of us on our first day are assigned to work with Sam in the market. But
well, I can't believe that that's possibly true.
So it just adds another layer to working with Medley Brothers and Wathans, is just having known Sam and having this family history.
Well, now Peter just jumps up and down and waves his hand to work with Sam all the time because you two have so many common interests.
There's actually a chain of restaurants that's popular around here that Sam likes to frequent.
One chain, I think you're probably talking about Bojangles, which you know that I love. I should have worn my Bojangles hat, but I feel like that'd be sort of weird since I had Popeye chicken for lunch today. I mean,
anybody's got any good?
You
I was
can't
just gonna say, if anybody out in the audience has good Golden Girls trivia, you throw it at these two, and all of your questions.
Or any sort of trivia. Yeah, I'm
any
a big trivia. All right, Monique, do you want to move on? Do you want us to move on and talk about the brands in specific? Because we kind of just talked about Medley Brothers.
Yeah.
So we can now talk about Wathans because we've only got, you know, I don't know how much more time we have. So, because we want to answer questions too.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yep. So we talked about the Medley Brothers brand, which is 102 proof, talked about the history of that, and we talked about what that brand is today, and in particular what it is with the supply situation today. But our key brand, our core brand is Wathans 94 proof single barrel bourbon. That's a retail-based brand. It does much better in off-premise than it does in on-premise. And Wathans was the brand started by my great-grandfather as his personal brand. And today we still choose every barrel. It's a single barrel product, proof to 94 proof. The bottles are numbered with which barrel they came from. And people often ask, what do the numbers mean? They really mean nothing. You know, barrel number 3620 might be Monique's favorite, and barrel number 6805 is Peter's favorite, and it's totally okay. With this brand, we have in the past, when we've had the supply to be able to do it, we have done a barrel selection program, or what's more commonly known as store picks. We will reintroduce, we haven't taken it away, but we're just not doing those in this climate right now. Although we're getting a lot of requests for them. So there's a consideration that in the second half of the year, we may reintroduce that in some capacity, perhaps for the holidays. But we do a store pick barrel selection program whereby retailers generally taste three products, three barrels. They taste them at bottle proof, 94 proof. And the reason they do is because, unusual to other distillers, we also choose our barrels at bottle proof. So every single barrel, we have a sample proved and proofed down to 94 proof. It's a very approximate thing, and they literally use an eyedropper. And they send us those sample bottles, and we taste them. And basically, we say, this is ready. This needs more time. This is green at 8 years old, unusually. So let's designate it for what we call special products. In other words, it'll be perfect at 10 or 12 years old. And our Old Medley 12-year-old bourbon is the perfect brand for that. So excuse me, we taste every barrel. I now select them. My dad is actually out of the selection. So if
I was going to ask
profile,
Sam, you always say we, and for a long time I assumed, I just picture like you and your dad, but there's got to be other people that help you with this, and you've never asked me or
there
Peter.
Are not. I taste them all. I get the little sample bottles, you know, and people think that sounds like a lot of fun, but you're not drinking them. And after about 5 or so, and we grade them all. We grade every single one of them. And we don't release how we graded them, because what we don't want to have happen is someone say, we do it on a 50-point scale, and someone say, well, this one was a 48 and this one was a 39. Why is it for sale? So we don't release our internal grades of each barrel, but we grade every single barrel. I can only do about 5 or so at a time before they start to kind of get on top of each other. And so I'll go and, you know, do something else and come back, or eat some saltines or whatever. But I always say we, because, you know, for a lot of years that was my dad, and then it was my dad and I, and now with his retirement and health issues, I'm doing all of the selection of those barrels. So they've all been tasted before they get to you, and they've all been tasted before they get to the shelf, and they've all been tasted before retailers might select for the Watkins Barrel Selection Program. And we taste them at 94 proof. The reason is my dad's philosophy is you want to taste it at the same proof that Joe Customer buys it at his corner liquor store. Because those of us who have tasted barrel proof samples and then had them bottled at bottle proof know that there can be differences that can be sometimes not in the direction you want them to be. So for our 94 proof single barrel Watkins, we taste them all at bottle proof and select them at bottle proof.
I was going to say too, I know you can't see it in this picture, and that's my fault, guys, but when you actually get one of these, the barrel number's way up there at the top, and then there's a little hang tag that has a little bit more about the story, and then when we're able to bottle them.
Well, we got rid of the hang tag on the new label.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that goes away, and then when we have bottled them for customers, then they get somewhere on the bottle. We did the very first barrel, Sam, you and I, when we sold a single barrel to a single customer at Big Star here in Chicago.
Yep, that was the very first one, and that was in our first barrel selection program. And now I designate, in most years I designate 50 or 75 barrels for that program, and we'll do those.
And there's the new label.
There's the new label right there.
Thanks, Dan just sent it to me. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, the fun one, I mean, Big Star was really fun because I remember you and I were working together. I was at a different wholesaler and working with the team at Big Star, and they obviously go through a ton of, you know, tequila, but a lot of bourbon. And I remember calling you, Sam, and I said, they want to buy a whole barrel. And you were like, who wants to buy a whole barrel? I'm like, this bar wants to buy a whole barrel. You're like, how long is it going to take them to go through a whole barrel of bourbon? You know, like, is this going to take a couple of years, or like, what's the thing? And I was like, you got to see this place. Like, you got to see the volume that they do. And I think I remember you saying, I talked to Dad. Dad doesn't really understand why this one bar wants to buy a single barrel. And I mean, you guys were really on the front lines of a lot of this stuff, I think, more than most people realize. I mean, you've been bottling single barrel for a long time, but you know, the idea of selling.
A couple of things about that. Do you remember how Big Star made their selection? They had 3 samples. They tasted all 3 of them and said, it's between A and C or whatever. And then they took those and put those into their old fashioned.
That's
and
right.
then how the particular barrel worked with their old-fashioned recipe, and that blew my mind. Now, I've since sold enough barrels that I realize most of the cool on-premise places do something like that.
That was really smart, though, because I think all of us as the geeks were agreed, let's say that A, on its own merit, was the best one. But we were all like, oh, but we would sip it neat, or we would put it on the rocks.
That's right.
And I think Laurent or Ben, you know, hopped up and said, that's not how most people are going to drink it. So let's put it in. Yeah, that
so
was.
They put it in their old fashioned. And Dan, who's on this call, will know that model sticks. And when I was in DC last summer, that is exactly what Jack Rose in DC did with Dan Searing and I sitting right there at their bar with their selection of the Watkins barrel proof, the barrel proof that we did. Or that was the Medley exclusive barrel proof. But they tasted it, narrowed it down, and then put it into their cocktails, and it changed their mind. So sometimes the best, most knowledgeable cocktail people will do that. Similarly, retail places, I've always been impressed. And Peter, I don't know if you've been with me when we've gone to Southern Spirits in Fort Mill, and they've bought several barrels. But Keith will taste, and he'll say, well, I like number 1, but our customers will like number 3.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll occasionally have a retailer. The dude in LA does that, Othman Gerard at the one there in Hollywood that we go to, Matt. He does the same thing. He'll say, I like this one, but our customers will like the other. And the good retailers will go with what their customers like. So that's sort of across the country there where we see different selection techniques. But I've always been impressed with the ones that know their customer base well enough to say, well, I'd like this one. And some people will even say, okay, we're going to pick barrel number 3 for our selection for our customers. But can you tell me where barrel number 1 goes, because I'd like to buy a bottle of it when it gets selected.
Yeah, Matt just chimed in and said K&L. Yeah, I get that a lot too. I taste samples and I'm thinking, oh, I want to know where this went. Actually, the single barrel that I have right here is the last one that I have from that very first Big Star barrel that we did.
Oh, wow.
Yep, it's not open.
I've held on to it. Interrupted. My screen just said I had a call from my father, and I can tell you what he's calling about. ESPNU is showing a replay of a Kentucky game from 2010, and it's in overtime, and we're about to win. And he probably thinks it's today. So he's happy about this game. I can tell you.
That's awesome. That's sweet.
So anyway, the Old Medley 12-year-old is our third sort of mainline brand. And it's a 12-year-old, aged for 12 years. It's the oldest by age brand that my family has ever done. We've never done bourbon over 10 years old in the history until we did this brand. We do a few barrels a year. We're going to have a release later this year, so all of you who are various wine boat distributors will have an allocation of this. At Monique's suggestion, we're going to do the allocation a little bit differently, and it's going to be as a thank you to some of our longer-term customers as best as we can, and to build and foment positive relationships. So that's how that's going to be. The glass is supposed to arrive on Tuesday. The bourbon is there, but the glass comes from overseas and is hung up in customs in Oakland. I did hear this morning it was supposed to come Tuesday, so that'll probably get done more quickly than we think. But Old Medley is very limited, and given our success in the past few years of our Wathins brand, we don't have barrels that are 9, 10, and 11 that will turn 12 in the next few years. So this year's release of Old Medley is going to be the last release for a few years. Old Medley is my favorite of the portfolio. It is 86.8 proof, which I chose because it was a unique proof, and also because there's no other bourbon on the shelf at that proof, and it is a proof that my family had used in previous generations. And this 12-year-old bourbon at 86.8 is really soft. And it's important to me that older bourbon have lower proof because it allows the complex flavors that are associated with spending all of that extra time in the barrel to shine through. The last thing you want to do is take a bourbon that's aged for 12 years and has amazing complex flavors, all of those like tropical fruit notes and pastry case notes and all of that coconut and especially the vanilla notes and all of those notes, and then overwhelm them because it's too high proof and you can't taste the subtle flavors. So
this one too, just because on the label, Sam, this is the one where you can see that it says sour mash. I know that these are all sour mash bourbons, but that might be, it hasn't come up as a question, but maybe there's some people hanging out with us right now that don't know what sour mash is. And I know that
sour mash is a production process, and it's interesting because I'm sure most of you know sour mash does not describe the flavor. It is not a sour flavor. A lot of consumers look at this and think, well, why is it sour? And it sort of drives me nuts when I go in to do a tasting in a bar and they'll say, well, now why is this sour? I can taste that it's sour. And I want to say, no, that's your mind playing a trick on you. My great-grandfather owned the brand Old Medley. He actually started it at the end of Prohibition. And an interesting quirk with that is that Prohibition ended in December of 1933, I think maybe December 5th of 33. And he had not been able to produce bourbon at all for the 12 or so years of Prohibition. But he started producing immediately. And he wanted to sell it immediately. But, 3 months later, all he had was 3-month-old bourbon. Now, it wasn't until 1964 that the federal government had made the rules that it has to be at least 4 years old to call it Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey. But in 1934, he sold 3-month bourbon under the brand name Old Medley as a marketing thing. He wanted people to think it was old. And so he sold 3-month bourbon. Have you ever had 3-month bourbon,
Yeah.
Monique?
Oh, yeah.
It's terrible. But when you've had no bourbon for 12 years, it's great. And then he sold 6-month bourbon under the name Old Medley, and people forgot 3-month bourbon existed. And then he sold, 9-month bourbon, and then 1 year. And he worked his way up until about 4 years. And 1937, 38 was when he had 4-year bourbon, and then he actually sold this distillery and these brands in 1939. So the sour mash on the label is sort of a tribute to his use of that production process and his label. At some level, I regret that we put it on that label because it's a little bit more confusing to people today because
We lost him.
Oh, no.
He's telling us all the secrets.
No.
so it's
Tell your dad it's going to be okay.
They won. I mean, I knew they were going to win. I remember this game, but he's now excited that they won. So anyway, it's a little bit confusing because people think it describes the flavor components, and it's actually a production process. And I don't know of any bourbons today that are not made with the sour mash process, by which you take a little bit of the previous distillate to jumpstart the fermentation process.
I mean, the big one is Peerless, and they put sweet mash all over the bottle, and they charge an arm and a leg for it because it's so much more expensive. So it comes up in conversation. I don't know, not often, but it comes up in conversation.
Yeah, so it's almost all bourbon is a sour mash production today. So that's the 3 mainline brands. There's the new Wathins label.
Oh, there we go. I didn't.
And then that's the single barrel, the Wathins single barrel. So let's talk about these 3, which are 3 of our special releases. So we tried to do some special release every year starting in about 2015. The first special release that we did was the one in the middle, Medley's Private Stock. We had some bourbon that was 10 years old that was great. And I was afraid if it got to 12, it might kind of go past its prime. The flavor profile that I look for in high-age bourbon is to choose those barrels and bottle those barrels before they start to get a chicory note to it, a little bit of chicory coffee note. I don't think that that's a pleasant flavor. So this was, right at perfection in 2015. So we did, I think, 1,300 cases or something of Medley's Private Stock. That was our 10-year-old bourbon. That was my great-great-grandfather's label pre-Prohibition. He called it Medley's Private Stock from like 1903 to whenever Prohibition started. He died in 1910. His son then did it until Prohibition started. But that's a cool-looking label that looks exactly like the label looked back pre-Prohibition. That was very well received, and we often get asked, when are you going to bring this back? And I think there's a good chance after this year's Old Medley release that our next high-age release is another Medley's Private Stock release. Don't know that for sure. That depends on how sales and everything go, but I think that might happen. We then started doing the what are known as the blue labels. So my dad turned 75 in 2016, and we did 11 barrels of single barrel proof called Medley Family Private Selection that Monique just showed you. And those 11 barrels, I took the samples to a family reunion on Father's Day in 2016 and sneaked around and had family members choose one barrel and got their signatures, and each one of the 11 barrels has a different family member who chose those barrels. So the one you think, I thought you had John Medley.
Yep.
Which was barrel number 1 of 11.
Barrel number 1.
He's my dad's first cousin, and he literally chose that, tasted them and said, I want this one, I want that one. And so we did that, and then those went out and were gone and taken by collectors pretty quickly. But it was Bill Thomas's idea to do this.
Sam, those were never
over a dinner at Jack Rose. And Dan was there, I think. You were sitting, I think Dan was at the table when Bill came up with the idea. And so he got 1 case of each. So he's the only place that got 1 case of each, and the rest went around the country. They're all long gone. And we introduced those to my dad at his 75th birthday party. And in addition, we did 75 6-packs of Charles Medley Master Distiller Diamond Collection, which were 450 bottles that we did especially for my dad's 75th birthday. And those were never sold. Those were only given out to our best distribution partners. The first 50 he gave away to his friends and family at his birthday party. And the remainder we've trickled out to our best distribution partners and retail partners. And
mine's in my trophy case at the office, so I don't have it, but it's, you know, Joe Seiler, who heads up our division here, Joe's got it in his little trophy case on the back. You know, it's, we love those. I'm not sure, I haven't tasted it. I mean, I haven't cracked the one open and drank it. I should probably not be so dear about it.
So going around and giving this out in the couple of years after that, as a thank you to our best customers, people who sold a lot of Medley Brothers in cocktails or bought barrels of Wathen's bourbon, Wathen's single barrel. It blew my mind how some people were like, I'm never going to open this. And I'm going to put it just what Monique said. And other people would right in front of me crack it open and say, let's taste it. Mm-hmm. And so it ran the gamut all the way of who would open it. And I'll tell you that my dad was given bottle number one out of 450. And I have bottle number 2. And I still have bottle number 2. And he drank bottle number 1. He was like, what am I going to keep it for?
Him.
So there's just the two differences.
It was really fun. That was really fun, Sam, because I don't think people... maybe they're used to somebody saying thank you for being a good, solid customer or whatever it was. But I was really fortunate with a few of them to actually get to go with you to some of these on-premise places where you just showed up literally to say thank you. And here's a thing for free that you can't buy anywhere. That's like the rarest bourbon.
You've had it because you were with me at the chicken place.
At Longman and Eagle.
Yeah. No. The chicken place with the outdoor.
Parsons?
Oh, Parsons.
Yes,
yeah.
Parsons. And we opened that. They opened it.
We did Longman and Parsons and Parachute.
Yep. And Parsons, we opened and drank it right there. And it's great. I mean, they're phenomenal. So anyway, that's the history of when you hear the blue label, that was a special release that won't be available. 2017, we introduced Wathen's Barrel Proof, which is on the right. I talked about that. That's the same bourbon, but at barrel proof. They're all hand numbered. We did 25 barrels the first year of this. We did 50 barrels in 2018, and they're numbered 26 to 75. We did 25 barrels of this last year, and they're numbered 76 to 100. Don't know what we'll do this year, if any, with the way the world is working. This may be a year to sit that out because it's just sort of a tough situation to ask people to do that. And then the one on the left is the new Wathen's label. And that's actually my grandfather's actual signature. And his label actually said not genuine without my signature. And the original brown label had my dad's signature on it. And as my dad moved to retirement, it was time to transition him off the bottle and put the Wathen signature back on there. So that bottle, there you see it again in that slide, is on the left. That label, we just introduced it in fall of last year. And so it's gone through the world now, and everything you get now is that. But you'll see the brown label from time to time still in places. But it was time. It was 22 years, 23 years almost. So we reintroduced a new look after that amount of time.
Well, what we kind of wanted to, and we'll definitely field some questions here as well if anybody's got them. But what we kind of wanted to, I don't necessarily want to say end on, but you wanted to talk a little bit about scarcity and kind of why these things have ebbs and flows, and they're a little bit more difficult to get. But also, speaking of your father, who's probably still bugging you about this Kentucky game right now, I wanted to share this beautiful photo with everyone.
So there we are. It's September of 2019 at the Kentucky Bourbon Festival Hall of Fame ceremony. My father was nominated for and selected to be a member of the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame, along with 6 or 7 other folks who are with different enterprises and different histories. He was the only distiller in the group, and so that's me on the right and my mother on the left. And so we were able to get him there, and he got the trophy, and it was a special day for our family and a special day for him. And the most special thing about it for me was watching him be able to interact with the others of his generation who are also Hall of Fame members who came to honor him. And it was very special to see. Ed Foote is a name that's sort of a legendary distiller. He was a distiller at Stitzel-Weller. I'd never met Ed Foote until that day. But so we were there, and that was a very special day. And, I wouldn't say it's the best picture in the world of me, and you can see I need a haircut today. But nonetheless, that was a fun and special occasion. And so, you know, that sort of marked the official and formal end of my dad's work and public representation of our brands.
Well, he's really, I mean, he's really important. His career's really important. And, you know, it's lovely to see him honored up there with folks like Jimmy Russell and Jim Rutledge and, you know, all these other legends, because, you know, you don't really get the name noted as much when you're part of a troupe of people working for Diageo. You know, you kind of get lumped together a little bit, but I mean, obviously really well deserved. And I know there was maybe even a little bit of fear about, you know, physically how that would be, but it looked like it turned out to be a beautiful day.
It did. And he managed, and he did a great job. And then we went to dinner with the family at the Old Talbot Tavern there in Bardstown and had a nice dinner, and that was enjoyable. And so that was a very big honor for my dad and for my family. And so that's a relatively current picture of Dad and my mother. They just celebrated their 50th anniversary a month ago.
Oh, wow.
We were going to do we will still do eventually, but we were going to do an event where I have tracked down, I should have brought in here, if you give me a minute, I'll run and get it and bring it in here. But I've tracked down a few bottles of bride and groom bourbon that was the bourbon served at their wedding in 1970. And so the bourbon was made in the 60s because it's 6-year-old bourbon that they made at Medley Distilling Company. And we're actually going to do an event. We were going to do it the Thursday before the Derby in Louisville, where we auction off, we sell tickets, and everybody who buys a ticket gets to get a taste of the bourbon, and then we auction off a full second bottle of that bourbon with the proceeds going to a nonprofit that I sit on the board of. And so maybe if the Derby ends up happening September 5th, we might do it the Thursday before. Who knows what the world is going to be like then. But that was our plan, to do it right before the Derby this year.
That's really cool, Sam. Actually, speaking of that, I'm going to take us off of screen share here. So now we're up here and you can see the everything off to the side. But another one of my favorite, I love this story about the bride and groom bourbon. I would definitely like to see that. But you also once told me a lovely story about a time in history when your family might have accidentally made Malort.
Well, so in the early 80s, that's true. In the early 80s, when my dad was working for Medley Distilling Company, it was at the time owned by a company out of Chicago called Schechter Incorporated. And Abe Schechter was the owner of that company, and he was always looking for new business production ideas, and he was a contract producer and a contract bottler. And one of the things that my dad contract produced in the early 80s was Jeppson's Malort. And he did exactly as they said. And he said they shipped in this thing. It looked like a bale of hay, and you make a neutral and you put it in a stainless tank and you dunk the bale of hay in for 30 days. And then you take it out and it has that flavor of that Malort. And he said, I followed their instructions exactly. I did exactly what they said. And I tasted and I thought, my God, I've done something so horribly wrong. This is so bad. I've screwed this contract. You know, I'm going to get fired and everything else. And of course, it was exactly what they wanted. If you've ever had Jeppson's Malort, you know that it has that flavor. So as a thank you, they gave Dad a case of Jeppson's Malort. And over the last 40 years, maybe half of it has been consumed. And so there were a few bottles left a few years ago in my parents' basement. And so I took a couple of those bottles, and then we actually took a bottle to the joint in Chicago.
To Longman. Because you told the story at Longman, and the guys were freaking out about tasting.
And then we gave them a bottle of Jeppson's Malort from the early 80s, which has the strip stamp and everything on it. And they compared with the bottle today, with the flavor today.
Those of you that are not from or in Chicago, if you don't know what Malort is, we highly, highly recommend finding a bottle and tasting it.
I don't highly recommend that.
Yeah. Its reputation precedes it for sure.
And it is well-earned reputation.
Laura's got some great videos. It's really fun to get someone's first reaction to something that's like so bitter. But of some of our Scottish friends and some other folks, and yep, Travis doesn't like it.
I don't like it either. But, you know, I get that it's a cult thing, especially in Chicago. Okay, we've finished our list. Do you have any other questions? Or anything I should still talk about, Monique? Peter?
We don't have any questions from the panelists at the moment.
Well, it was at one point, Maddie wanted to know why you were so obsessed with 7s, but then it kind of turned into 8s. He was saying,
yeah, that's just a coincidence.
Yeah, that's what I figured. Because then it goes all 8s and 8th generation-y.
Yes.
I mean, you're so well prepared for this presentation, Sam. It's not like you haven't done this before, but it's always so special to...
Well, I know, I look at the list of names, and there's a few people on there who I know have heard all of this before, especially Monique, because it's been like, how many years? 10 years since we've been working together?
Yep. Yep.
So I know you've heard every story there is. And I shouldn't say that, I shouldn't tell people this, but I defer to you and your advice more than I defer, listen, you know that that's true, more than I defer to any other person in this industry.
Yeah.
You know that that's true.
You're like my crazy brother. You know I love you.
Well, that may be.
What an honor.
Yeah. I think too, it was one of the really interesting experiences. I was so blessed to get to spend some time with your dad on that trip to Chicago. And I just remember sitting outside at Big Star, and he was just with Ben and Laurent and I, and he was making note. He was drawing just like stills and all these other things. Yeah. They still have them. I mean, the guys still have them. Laurent still has them like archived a little bit over at Big Star. But it was after Devil's Cut had come out. And who makes that? Jim Beam. And it was Jim like, Beam. We soak the barrels in super hot water. We steam the barrels or whatever to like pull the rest of the stuff out. And I said, you know, Charles, do you have any thoughts? Like, does that seem innovative? And he was just like, are you kidding me? He's like, when I was 12, he's like, he was like, my dad had me take a bunch of steam and go put it in a barrel and try to do the same thing. And it was just so interesting that he has memories of being a child doing these things.
Well, and specifically, he said that they've tried everything, and they tried pressure washing and heat washing out the barrel, heat rinsing the barrels to get more bourbon out. He said the problem is, there were two problems. The first problem is that the bourbon that you heat rinse out of the barrels after you've dumped the barrels is more tannic and bitter than the rest of your bourbon, and it changes your flavor profile and not necessarily in a great way. He said, and the second thing is they couldn't get people to hold the end of the hose because people kept getting scalded, you know.
We got a couple questions. Antonio wants to know, what do you top the barrels with?
What do you mean top the barrels with?
That is an interesting question. I mean, because you're not going to top off the barrels as they mature.
No, you can't. You don't.
Yeah, you can't legally, you can't top them with anything.
Maybe he means barrel heads? Is that what he's talking about?
I don't know.
I think it might be more of a wine reference. Maybe he's...
Yeah, because you can't really top them. I mean, bourbon, you can't go back in and top them off with anything.
And so when you dump them, you know, you lose some every year. You get to pay tax on the whole amount every year. The rule of thumb is that you lose 3 to 4% every year. We actually lose about 18% the first year and 2 to 3% each additional year. And the reason you lose so much the first year is that barrel is brand new. And so it works like a sponge, and 18% of your bourbon soaks into the barrel. But you cannot top them off. You cannot add more bourbon or add water or anything to them. You dump them, and at about 12 years, you're generally 50% if you're lucky, you know, is a model for that. They're 50% full. Some of them will get too old, particularly if they're a leaker, and they'll have nothing in them. And you've still paid for them every year and paid to make them and paid to store them. And we don't own warehouses. We rent our warehouse space. And so we're paying rent for those as well. So we have to be very careful not to let bourbon go so long that you get nothing out of a barrel. And in fact, when we did the Wathen's Barrel Proof last year, 2018, we had one of our 50 that was obviously a leaker. It produced 6 packs, and that was it. Mm-hmm. So I didn't present that to anybody. I kept it. I tagged it especially for sale in the state of Colorado, and it's actually still here.
Maybe you'll change your mind.
It's still in the warehouse. I got an email last week because they had a manager turnover, and the previous guy had locked it down in the computer system where no one could order it. And the next guy was like, what is this? Mm. And I was like, that's what that is.
Special. Matt wrote in, what was the decision like when your father told you that you'd take on the brand?
Well, when I went to college, I didn't know I was going to go into the bourbon business. And I actually worked out of the industry in my first job after college, largely because I wanted to get experience in an industry in which I didn't have sort of a built-in advantage or knowledge base. So I actually worked in the corporate office of a hotel company for a couple of years, which is, you know, when you're in sort of the corporate office of a company, it's a little bit more like The Office TV show than it is the fun things that we do in this business where we're out, you know, restaurants, liquor stores, training sessions, et cetera, doing Zoom things like this. So then I decided to go to graduate school because I wanted to start my own business. And I did, and I started my own business, which I still own to this day, which is a market research company. It is far less exciting to talk about than bourbon because a lot of my clients are medical software, medical device, things like that that are not fun to talk about. Everybody wants to talk about bourbon. Not everybody wants to talk about ambulance and fire software, but that company literally has been one of my biggest clients on my market research company for quite a few years. Then in 2003 is when I took over for the distillery business. I had worked part-time with my dad. At that point, we had Wathans only, and it was one brand, one proof, one size in about 6 markets. And we did a few hundred cases a year, and that was it. And I said, Dad, I think we can build this. Let's honor our family's history. And so I focused in 2003 on 6 major markets: Boston, New York, Chicago, LA, San Francisco, and Atlanta. And the only one of those 5 distributors that we remain with is Quality Wines in Atlanta. The others we've changed a couple of times, or they've gone belly up, or we've had to do different things. But I focused for 5 years on those markets, which was a period of learning for me, learning how the industry works, going and doing ride withs when you go to 15 liquor stores in one day and only one of those ever possibly would buy your product, and learning how the industry works. And then in 2008, I started working to research my family's history with brands and recover the rights to the brands that we owned in my family's history. I learned a lot about trademark law and paid a lot of money to learn about trademark law because our company is effectively a branding company today. And we did a lot of research. We covered quite a few trademarks, and I had to do that without telling my dad what I was doing because my dad is not quite as circumspect as I am. And those trademarks, Medley Brothers, Old Medley, et cetera, if someone else had wanted to go register them, they would have had just as much right to them as we did. The trademarks had expired. So spent about 5 years doing that. And then in 2013, introduced Old Medley. In January, introduced Medley Brothers. In the fall, have introduced our special releases in 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19 since then, and have really spent the last about 10 years really working to build our portfolio, build our reputation, develop distributor relationships with distributors that have the same philosophy that we have. And we are in no open state are we with one of the biggest distributors. We're not with them in anywhere because that isn't our ethos. It isn't our enterprise. And so it was important to us to get to work with people like Monique and Peter, the rest of you guys from the Winebow companies, who some of you got inherited by Winebow, and some of you I knew at places before Winebow, and some of you I haven't yet met, but I'm going to at some point very soon.
I was going to say, speaking of that, Paris writes out in the chat over here, I'm a new rep in San Diego. So if you walked into a retailer you're meeting for the first time and you have 30 seconds, what's that elevator pitch? How are you going to get their attention?
So the elevator pitch in 30 seconds with a retailer, this assumes that you've pre-qualified the retailers and figured out what's a Medley retailer. So if you've done that and you know you're in the right place, you say, this is a family-owned historic portfolio of Kentucky straight bourbon whiskeys with 3 brands that have 3 different stories. Medley Brothers, 102 proof, perfect for cocktails. Wathans, single barrel, the best retail brand. We do a barrel program on it in sometimes, and our special release allocated, highly allocated Old Medley 12-year-old bourbon. But these are all family-owned, historic brands from the state of Kentucky. that's your elevator speech.
Yeah. I mean, Kentucky bourbon's hot right now, and it's got great consistency. I'm really happy that we've been fairly consistent on Wathans, no matter what. Like everything's going to ebb and flow, but it's continued to grow in terms of reputation. People find it to be very consistent. Like I'm on a lot of those gray Facebook sites and all those things, kind of seeing what BS people are writing about all kinds of brands, but it's really recognized for its consistency and very fair price. So people feel like this is something that you can grab and drink daily. It's not going to, completely empty out your wallet.
Oh, for sure. The quality and the age and what you get in the bottle far exceeds the price. Sam, I've got a question on innovation. We were talking a little bit a while ago about steaming the barrels and Devil's Cut. And when you go into a retail store now, it seems like every brand's going much wider with their finishes or whatever innovation they're releasing. Do you think bourbon is a category that needs innovation?
Well, Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey, the answer is no, it can't. There's rules about what that is.
Sure.
But I think that everything will always be subject to innovation. And whether it's, gimmicky innovation, like we're going to make this age more quickly by putting it under pressure or whatever people are going to do.
Making it listen to Metallica.
Yeah, whatever. And that's not a joke. That's literally a thing.
Wow.
Or whether it's
Sam, would you make your barrels listen? What band would you make your barrels?
Oh, you know the answer.
You know the answer.
Is it Air Supply?
Of course, I would be in Vegas right now, literally today, getting ready to go to an Air Supply concert, but for this COVID thing.
I have a recording of Sam singing it at the beginning. He didn't know.
Oh, because when that came on, yeah. Don't play that. I'm not a good singer.
I won't.
Save it forever. Save it forever and ever.
But yes, I would be at Air Supply tonight, and I enjoy them.
Oh,
and
wow.
Air Supply is a total experience. It's, I fear that they won't be able to do this now with how things are going to be with this new normal. But the dudes go out in the audience and it's like grown men weeping at Air Supply and crushing up against them to take pictures. It's absolutely incredible. They are showmen of sort of a nostalgia era that is a little bit gimmicky to a lot gimmicky, that is just a show like you can't believe. In fact, I posted a video on my personal Facebook page that I took at an Air Supply concert last summer, and I was wearing this same shirt, of course, which is the Kentucky Colonels, the ABA team that used to be in Louisville, that won the ABA title 45 years ago today. So that's why I'm wearing this shirt.
I'm sorry that I interrupted
Historic
your
day.
conversation about innovation, but I do want you to finish that thought.
So
I think that might be it. I think it might just be having barrels listen to Air
be,
Supply.
There's innovation that may not be what we like as sort of old school connoisseurs. And some of that innovation is less about finish and more about adding flavors. And so, there's big brands that sell a hell of a lot of bourbon that are cherry flavored bourbon. And that is an innovation, whether we like it or not. That's an innovation that's very commercially successful. Some of your, less commercially successful innovations are the finish in this old barrel or that kind of thing. But I get that everybody's got to try something new. Everybody's got to try something new. Anything that's released with the Medley name on it is always going to be Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. We're not going to try to rapid age it. We're not going to try to, add anything to it. We're not going to do that.
It's beautiful the way it is.
But
Dan wants us to end on a happy Memorial Day note.
Mm-hmm.
He'd like to know how many baseball stadiums you visited and if you've seen any no-hitters.
Dan, you know the answer to this, or you at least know partially. I went to a baseball game. Several of you I've been to baseball games with, including Dan, who was like, this is the first baseball game I've been to in 10 years, but it was a ton of fun. I've seen games in 53 major league ballparks. I'm a big baseball fan. There are only 30 ballparks, but I've seen games in 23 that are closed. I was scheduled to go to the opening game in the new stadium in Texas on March 31st, but that's been canceled. So I'm still at 53. And in the course of going to those 53 ballparks, I've seen 2 no-hitters. And I have so many friends who are big baseball fans, who've seen 1 no-hitter. And I always say, you're not a true fan unless you've seen 2 no-hitters, because each one puts the other in perspective. which is just so obnoxious, but so perfect.
Well, on that note, Sam, we've gone 90 minutes.
Let me see what these other two questions are. Oh,
I'm bringing them up.
okay.
And I feel like you answered Matt's question. I mean, you talked a lot about, tons of it. Yeah, tons and tons of advice and information. No, this has been great. We recorded this. Laura's got that, and, we'll get it so that people can use it and go back and watch it, and we can share
Laura,
it.
please edit the beginning, especially if I was singing or saying things I shouldn't say.
You can't tell me what to do, Sam.
No,
Please, I'm begging you.
director's cut, Laura.
Yeah,
I have a very special bottle of bourbon for you for next time.
There'll be a director's cut with commentary.
Oh, God.
I love it. I love it. Well, for all of you out there watching and listening with us, I hope that you learned a lot from Sam. I always hear something new. I mean, Sam, yeah, I've seen this song and dance before, but I actually always learn something new from you, and I appreciate it so much. We are so, so proud to represent you. Not a lot of people get to have, a family of actual Kentucky bourbons with this level of heritage and consistency and great pricing, and have a really awesome and transparent partner like you who wants to work with us. And I don't know about taking advice, but I think we collaborate fairly well. And you know that we love you.
Monique, I absolutely take your advice. You know that.
It's pretty good advice sometimes.
Awesome.
For those of you that have been joining us weeks on end, we appreciate it. We're going to continue along with the series. Next week on Tuesday, we are going to be speaking to some of our French friends, Jean-Francois and only Francois, about Calvados and cognac and the difference between agricole and regular rum. So we'll be doing that on Tuesday, this same bat time, same bat channel. And next Friday, we will have David Suro back speaking ethical agave. I know a lot of you were out there. That one went really long. We definitely knew that we needed another one. So I'm super, super excited to have David back. Laura, you want to chime in about your survey and feedback?
Oh yeah, for sure. So now I'm nervous that I didn't add it in or something. But as you sign out, there should be, fingers crossed, a link to a survey that takes less than 2 minutes just to give us a little bit of feedback about what you thought about this, what we can improve, what was good, what was not as awesome, just so that we can make it worthwhile for your time. You'll also be receiving that same survey in a follow-up email 24 hours that will include links to the next few Raising a Glass webisodes. So
can't wait to see you guys again. And this video will get posted in the next probably week up on our YouTube page, and we'll share it internally with our team as well.
For sure. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for hanging with us, Peter and Sam.
Thank you, guys.
Appreciate you guys. Have a great holiday weekend. Get out there and enjoy it. I hope it's beautiful everywhere. Be safe, stay distance, all that fun stuff.
See you guys.
Love you guys. Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.